Ever look in the mirror and wonder, am I just a walking, talking product of my DNA? Or is every single experience I have literally rewriting my code? Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're taking our source material and turning it into the absolute ultimate study guide on human personality. We're going to unpack the whole shebang, the biological, psychological, and environmental determinants that make you, well, you.
So, what's on the agenda for this explainer? We'll briefly run through defining personality and its core determinants. Then, we'll dive into type and trait theories, psychoanalytic and social cognitive views, and finally wrap up with behavioral assessment.
Section 1. Defining personality. What actually makes you, you?
Right out of the gate, to get us in the proper study guide mindset, let's look at this first self-assessment question. Who has said that personality is the dynamic organization of traits? It's a great question because it forces us to pinpoint the actual researchers behind these ideas. And spoiler alert, the answer is Gordon Allport. Honestly, his definition is arguably the most important one for you to memorize.
See, in everyday life, we usually talk about personality as, just how outgoing or socially attractive someone is, but Allport gives us this incredibly precise scientific definition. He calls it the dynamic organization within the person of the psychophysical systems that determine unique adjustments to one's environment. Okay, I know that sounds like a mouthful, but every single word here matters. Dynamic organization means your personality is always growing, always adapting, yet it's held together by a central core. And psychophysical, that's just a brilliant way of saying your mind and body are totally fused together. It's not just all in your head, it's physical too.
Now, to really pin this down, we have to separate personality from two things people constantly confuse it with: character and temperament. Character is all about moral values and ethical judgments. Basically, is someone acting good or bad? Temperament, on the other hand, is your raw, inborn biological baseline, like how naturally adaptable or easily irritated you are from birth. So the key takeaway here is that while your character and your temperament are absolutely huge pieces of the puzzle, they aren't the whole picture.
Section 2. Determinants of personality. Let's look at the building blocks.
We've got to start with biology, right? Because our physical makeup heavily impacts how we see ourselves. Think about homeostasis, your body's way of keeping things like blood sugar and temperature stable. We all know what it's like to get hangry, but it goes deeper than that. If your blood sugar stays spiked, it can actually lead to depressive mental states. And physical traits themselves change things too. Imagine a kid who hits a growth spurt way earlier than everyone else. Adults might start treating them like they're much older, which kind of forces them to develop a more mature personality faster than their friends. Basically, biology sets the stage.
Speaking of biology, there's this really fascinating older theory by William Sheldon called somatype theory. He essentially argued that your physical body shape directly dictates your temperament. According to him, ectomorphs, the tall, thin folks, are naturally quiet and sensitive. Endomorphs, who are more round and soft, are relaxed and sociable. And mesomorphs, the strong, muscular types, are super active and assertive. Now, modern psychology kind of side-eyes this because the empirical methodology was pretty weak, but it's an awesome historical stepping stone for understanding the mind-body connection. Just for fun, which bucket do you think you'd fall into?
Fast forward to today, and modern psychology relies on a concept called interactionism. It's basically a giant math equation. Personality development equals physical determinants times psychological determinants times environmental determinants. Think about how environment plays out here with 3 quick examples. Say you have a kid who gets tons of social acceptance. They're probably going to develop some bold confidence, right? But a teenager facing social deprivation, they might develop a defensive withdrawal. Or think about the youngest kid in a massive family. They might become hyper-competitive just to get some attention. You are literally the product of all these variables multiplying together.
Section 3. Type and trait theories. How do we actually categorize you?
Okay, let's talk numbers. Specifically, the number 16. A researcher named Raymond Cattell used this incredibly complex statistical method called factor analysis to sift through thousands of human traits. He eventually boiled them down to just 16 core source traits. These are the deep, underlying building blocks, totally different from surface traits, which are just the obvious behaviors we can easily see. He even factored in constitutional traits that are purely genetic and built a whole specification equation to predict human behavior. The mind-blowing part? His research found that traits like intelligence are actually 65 to 70% genetic, while other traits lean much more heavily on the environment.
Then we have Hans Eysenck, another absolute giant in trait theory. He gave us the PAN model: psychoticism, extroversion, and neuroticism. Eysenck was all about the biology. In fact, he proposed 2 distinct neurophysiological bases for these traits. He figured that extroversion is physically driven by a part of the brain called the ARS, the ascending reticular activating system,
which basically stimulates the cortex. And neuroticism? He linked that to the visceral brain, or the limbic system, which controls our emotional reactions. So he's showing us that these individual differences aren't just habits we pick up. They are literally hardwired into our neurophysiology.
Building off of Cattell and Eysenck, we get to McCrae and Costa, who helped formalize the famous Big Five factor model. And this whole model comes from something called the lexical hypothesis, which is just this brilliant, simple idea. If an individual difference is truly important to human interaction, we'll eventually invent a single word for it in our language. By crunching the data on words across tons of different languages, researchers consistently found the exact same 5 major dimensions of personality popping up everywhere.
Section 4. Psychoanalytic and social cognitive views.
Come on, you didn't think we'd do a study guide on personality without bringing up Sigmund Freud, did you? Freud's psychoanalytic theory gives us that famous tripartite model of the mind. You've got the instinctual id, the moral superego, and the conscious ego just stuck in the middle trying to manage it all. He argued we're fundamentally driven by unconscious forces, Eros, the life and sex instinct, and Thanatos, the aggressive death instinct, and he believed your personality was essentially locked in by unconscious conflicts during early childhood psychosexual stages: oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital. Now, as a critical study task, make sure you note the major issues with Freud's theory. It relies on super subjective case studies with almost no hard empirical support. There's a heavy historical gender bias, and it drastically overemphasizes sexuality in early development.
On the complete opposite end of the spectrum is Albert Bandura and his social cognitive theory. Bandura didn't care about hidden unconscious drives. He focused on the self system and observational learning, meaning we learn by watching other people. His big concept is reciprocal determinism. It's this continuous dynamic loop between your cognition, your behavior, and your environment. Imagine a dad with a really pessimistic mindset. That mindset shapes the environment his kids grow up in, which changes how those kids behave, which then feeds right back into how they think. It's a constant cycle. But the really empowering implication here for therapy is that by intentionally changing someone's environment or modeling better behaviors for them, we can actually help them reshape their internal personality.
Okay, so we've covered a ton of theory. But how do we take all these complex ideas and actually use them? This visual signals our final major shift. We're moving out of the abstract world of personality theories and into the incredibly practical side of psychology, how we actually measure human behavior out there in the real world.
Section 5. Behavioral assessment.
Behaviorists look at things a bit differently. To them, personality is really just a huge collection of learned responses. So, if you want to change it, you use a functional behavioral assessment, or FBA. Let's look at a clinical example. Say you have a student who is violently disrupting class. Instead of just labeling that kid as bad, an FBA asks, what function is this behavior actually serving? First, you assess the cause. Maybe the kid just wants to escape a really frustrating math worksheet. Second, you designed a targeted treatment intervention, like teaching them a better way to ask for a quick break. And third, you evaluate the outcomes to make sure the disruptions actually decrease.
So how do they gather all this data? Well, professionals use a few specific types of assessment. Direct observation is exactly what it sounds like, watching the client in their natural setting. Analog assessment is more like a simulation or role play. For another clinical example, a therapist might actually role-play a crowded party scenario to figure out a client's specific social anxiety triggers. Then there's indirect assessment, which looks back retrospectively, and idiographic assessment, which is highly tailored to a specific individual and their unique disorder. Now, all of these methods are great, but they absolutely have limitations. The biggest one, observer bias. That's when the person taking the notes accidentally lets their own subjective feelings influence the results.
Because of issues like observer bias, all these assessments have to meet 2 rock-solid scientific standards: reliability and validity. Reliability is all about consistency. If 3 different observers are watching the exact same behavior at the exact same time, they need to agree on what they're seeing. Validity, on the other hand, is about accuracy. Does the data you gathered observing a kid in a classroom actually predict how they'll behave at home? To get better reliability, you usually have to bring in multiple highly trained observers. And to improve validity, you have to run multifaceted assessments across a bunch of different environments.
Which brings us to our final thought. We've explored the biological building blocks. We looked at Cattell and Eysenck's deep trait theories. We uncovered Freud's unconscious drives. We modeled Bandura's social learning, and we dug into the rigorous real-world observation of the behaviorists. So after all that, I have to ask you, do you think your personality is pre-programmed by your biology, or is it constantly being rewritten by your environment? As we've seen, the truth is a wild, dynamic interaction of both. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep studying, keep questioning everything, and I'll see you next time.